Maybe I'll get started. Welcome everybody on behalf of the Race and Culture Committee at the Guild of Psychotherapists to our first seminar in our series, Decolonizing Psychoanalysis. This series is intended to open up conversations about psychoanalysis by initiating transatlantic dialogues between academics and psychotherapists, bringing clinical responses to their academic decolonial work. How will clinicians speak to those concepts from the standpoint of their practice? And how can we use these ideas to think about subjectivity, development, intergenerational trauma, and so on? So before going on to the housekeeping, which is kind of my job today, I want to take the opportunity to thank Anshu Sravastava from the Guild of Psychotherapists, who's been collaborating with Ivan Ward and Stefan Mariansky on this series of talks. So this is the first one, and I'm going to plug the second one, so you've got that all jotted down. It's on Saturday, the 23rd of April. It's called Occupying Psychoanalysis in the Post-Colonial World, Fanon Zone of Non-Being and the Subject of Racism. The speakers are Gautam Basu Thakur and Sharon Numa. So you'll get more details about that in the continuation of today, but just so you know, and you can come and join us for all the talks. A bit about the timing. So Anshu is going to be our chair today, and he's going to introduce us to to the speakers, and Robert Beshara will be speaking for about 45 minutes. Then we'll have a 10-minute break, and when we come back, Fakhry Davis will be responding. There'll be a moderated discussion where you'll be invited to participate in asking questions and making comments. So hopefully we can get that going as well. And we also thought that today it'd be great if you could use the chat to introduce yourselves to each other. And if you want to make comments, the chat button is there. And we'll hopefully pick up some of the interesting things that we can bring back into the discussion. So we'll keep an eye out for that. But if you've got a question that you would like and a comment you would like to participate in the discussion, we prefer you to speak directly to the speakers. And you can do this by using the raised hand function. I'm sure you're already quite familiar with this now, but just to remind you that on your computers and tablets, you'll find that in the reactions at the bottom. And on your mobile, you'll find it on the three little dots that say more. And if you click on there, you'll find the raised hand. When we see you've got your hand raised, we'll then invite you, and you can unmute and you can speak directly to us all. Last thing is that we're going to be recording today, so please be aware of that. And the recordings will be available for all attendees for 30 days after the event. I'm going to hand over to Anshu now, and that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona, and good afternoon, everybody. Instead of reading out Robert and Fakhry's bios to introduce them, which seems a bit colonial in that it misses so much, I'm going to have a short chat with each of them. Robert before his paper, and then Fakhry after the break and before his response. But first, I'd be grateful if you would just allow me a moment to say a little bit about how these seminars have come to pass and why they're important. To explain, I'm going to read a short excerpt from an advert that the Race and Culture Committee has recently put together to accompany some new scholarships the Guild is offering to prospective trainees from underrepresented minority ethnic groups. You can find the full advert on the Guild's website. It says this: the Guild is committed to challenging inequality and systemic racism within the psychoanalytic psychotherapies and in making psychotherapy accessible and relevant to members of all communities. We know that students from these communities are less likely to train and more likely to drop out of psychotherapy, and often find training silencing and traumatizing, and therefore difficult. The Guild of Psychotherapists has a strategic aim to develop a training that meets the needs of students from minority or marginalized communities, supports a culture of belonging for all students and staff, and one that produces therapists that are particularly well qualified to work with individuals of any background. The Guild of Psychotherapists is committed to standing in solidarity with protests against racism and racial injustice. Put simply, these seminars are part of this ambition. Is the Guild there yet? No. Is there a need and interest in this ambition? Well, we've had well over 200 people sign up for the seminar today, so I think that speaks for itself. The Guild, that's we, have taken a very important turn on the road recently. Support for the work of the Race and Culture Committee and this seminar series is part of that turn. And the direction is good, but we're still traveling on roads that exist within colonial territory. As Robert puts it in his paper, within a particular ideological episteme or time, a time of ongoing coloniality and inequality. So I would urge you to listen to Robert's paper with a thought from the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek in mind. When Žižek says, the first question we should always ask is the way I perceive the problem part of the problem? The problem is complex, and Robert's paper maps out this complexity and gives us new perspectives from which to view the road ahead. So I'd like to introduce Robert. Hi, Robert.
Hi.
I wondered if you might be able to begin by telling us a bit about your background and what brought you to psychoanalysis.
Okay. So I'm originally from Cairo, Egypt. That's where I was born and grew up. And my entryway into psychoanalysis was through the arts, actually, because I'm an artist first before being an academic. So it was surrealism, really, that got me into psychoanalysis, paintings, films, etc. So it was around that time that I read Freud in college and was engaged in music, theater, film, writing, all of that. Then that interest developed over time into an academic one when I did my PhD in psychology and started using psychoanalysis as a theoretical tool for critiquing psychology in a way. And so there's a shift to like a more theoretical, research-based approach. And then later I started, and then there's the clinical kind of third act, which is beginning of last year, I started my formation to become a research analyst. And of course, there's the experience of being an analysand, which is important as well, right? And that's something that maybe connects those three threads that I mentioned.
Yes, and you're working in New Mexico, and I think
Yes,
from hearing you speak before, the choice of the particular institution you're working in is part of your political position as well.
yeah, so I'm based in northern New Mexico. New Mexico is not known to be one of the wealthiest states in the US, and but it's wealthy not necessarily in economic terms, but definitely in terms of culture and history. So there's something like 21 indigenous tribes in New Mexico, and these are active tribes, so they're not just tribes that we read about that have existed at one point and then ceased to exist. These are tribes that continue to exist, that have forms of government that, and you know, have their languages and cultures and traditions. And so yeah, my students basically are majority Hispanic or Latino, Latina, Latinx, or indigenous Native American from different tribes around the campus.
So the audience will know from following your work or from reading the bios that came out with, you know, promoting this event about your recent books. Decolonial Psychoanalysis Towards Critical Islamophobia Studies, which came out in 2019, and then Freud and Said, Contrapuntal Psychoanalysis as Liberation Praxis, which was published in 21. But I know that just this year, you've published a new book where you've translated the work of Egyptian philosopher Murad Wahba into English, entitled Fundamentalism and Secularization. Can you just give us a few words about the importance of doing this book for your overall project?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier how I use psychoanalysis as a way to critique psychology. So a lot of, because basically a lot of what I do has to do with critical psychology or critique more generally, but I feel that sometimes it's not just enough to do critique. Sometimes we have to present something positive from other parts of the world. And so one of the things I'm kind of dedicated to intellectually is translating works by Arabic speaking theorists and philosophers from, the global South, whether from Egypt or elsewhere, in order to show that, because oftentimes Arabic philosophy or any kind of philosophy from the global South, it's reduced to a historical event. So, for example, in the case of Arabic philosophy, it's reduced to a medieval philosophy, something that happened in the past, whereas obviously we have contemporary philosophers thinking about issues that are relevant in the global North as well as in the global South. So in many ways, I see that when I bring that perspective, it's more global in a way, because it engages with these issues that we're interested in the global North, but it's doing it from the perspective of the global South. And I think that if we're really interested in a kind of dialogue that can lead to a better world without being cheesy, right? That's the kind of work we have to do. We have to really engage with thinkers and theorists from outside the global North. And so this is the first translation. I'm also overseeing, I'm actually overseeing a series of translations with Gerlach Press in Germany. And so hopefully maybe next year or later this year, we're going to see more translations coming out.
Okay. Well, looking forward to that, because I think that is absolutely central to the spirit of what we're trying to do with these series of seminars as well, and the work we're doing at the Guild. So I think we've come to the point where I'm going to hand over now for you to read your paper. And if we could, we'll try and work towards 4 o'clock for a break after the paper, which is around 45 minutes away. So thank you, Robert. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anshu, and I appreciate the Guild's invitation. And I think this is a very important intervention. So hopefully we'll get to have a fruitful dialogue in the end. Psychoanalysis, like subjectivity, is divided. On the one hand, it is a praxis whose orientation revolves around listening to and deciphering the unconscious. As such, it is a powerful tool for both theorizing unconscious racism and practicing anti-racism. On the other hand, psychoanalysis is a discipline located in a particular material history. Psychoanalytic clinics and institutions are also operating under specific ideological conditions. Therefore, it is vital to think of the oppressive dimensions of psychoanalysis as a function of its being a Euromodern project invented around the time of new imperialism. In what follows, I will argue for the worlding of psychoanalysis through both an immanent critique and a decolonial reading. The first approach critiques psychoanalysis from within its own logic in an effort to emphasize its radical potential. The second approach critiques psychoanalysis from without through the lens of the non-European other. Ultimately, the dialectical move is to be able to both appreciate what psychoanalysis has to offer us today in terms of theory and practice, while also critiquing the false universality of ethnocentric psychoanalytic notions. The bifurcation of psychoanalytic theory stems from Sigmund Freud's division as a subject, what Sander Gilman characterizes as the double bind of the Jewish medical scientist, both physician and prospective patient, both scientist and Jew, both the observer and the observed. I read this bifurcation in terms of two political strands inherent within psychoanalysis. a liberal conservative strand, and a radical one. I qualify the liberal conservative strand as colonial secularism, and the radical strand as decolonial atheism. Whereas racism is the essence of the first strand, humanism is the driving force behind the second one. According to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, capitalism requires inequality, and racism enshrines it. Racial capitalism does not denote the type of capitalism. Rather, it names the very fact that capitalism was always racial. Charisse Burden-Stelly argues that the analytical framework of racial capitalism helps us see that race and class, or racialized oppression and capitalist exploitation, are mutually constitutive. On the conservative end of the spectrum, psychoanalysis is used as a colonial tool to enact the civilizing mission of Euromodernity in the way that it furthers the logic of capitalism and imperialism. On the liberal end of the spectrum, psychoanalysis is a silent bystander on questions of oppression and violence. What do I mean by colonial secularism? In order to answer that question, I must first define secularism. According to Talal Asad, secularism is both a political doctrine which arose in modern Euro-America and an enactment by which a political medium, representation of citizenship, redefines and transcends particular and differentiating practices of the South that are articulated through class, gender, and religion. The difficulty with secularism as a doctrine of war and peace in the world, Assad continues, is not that it is European and therefore alien to the non-West, but that it is closely connected with the rise of a system of capitalist nation states. In other words, the problem with secularism is that it is not truly secular, since it is a modern Euro-American political doctrine housed within the apparatus of racial capitalism. Yet, it is ideologically promoted as a universal panacea, particularly through humanitarian imperialism in the non-European world. While I am for secularization as an autochthonous process, I am against secularism as a Euromodern ideology. Similarly, Alberto Toscano critiques secularism as a normative political notion, which displaces the so-called Judeo-Christian or European heritage. Toscano shows that the psychoanalytic institution can problematically function as the midwife of secularism when it takes the parameters of acculturation and of pathology, anomaly, and dislocation provided by Western Christendom and its secular inheritance as somehow normative. He warns of the dangers of secularizing the psychoanalytic subject and of turning psychoanalysis into a secular clinic. Psychoanalysis fails when it is an ideological clinic dedicated to converting non-European subjects, particularly Muslims, to secularism. In sum, the aim of Toscano's critique is to distinguish between secularism's normative narrative and the methodological atheism of psychoanalysis. By methodological atheism, he means a praxical, materialist, and naturalist inquiry into trans-individual behavior and psychic structure, which is not generative of further political fantasies, illusions of autonomy, or cultural superiority. To put it differently, the methodological atheism of psychoanalysis affords psychoanalytic subjects with a pluriversality of ontologies and epistemologies, which are not possible within the false universality of secularism, since it is in essence a provincial and thereby ethnocentric ideology, a civilizing mission, death-driven by the profit motive. On the other hand, psychoanalysis as decolonial atheism is a radical liberation praxis, which implies that it is actively both anti-capitalist and anti-racist. Stephen Frosch writes, psychoanalysis needs and can never escape its Jewish provocations, and in these can be found some of the energy with which it is possible for psychoanalysis to contribute to the ongoing struggle for a decolonized world. His notion of psychoanalysis as decolonial Judaism is not equivalent to the Nazi characterization of psychoanalysis as a Jewish science. Rather, it is an echo of the argument that the contributions of Freud are to be understood largely as a contemporary version of and a contemporary contribution to the history of Jewish mysticism. According to David Bacon, Freud consciously or unconsciously secularized Jewish mysticism, and psychoanalysis can intelligently be viewed as such a secularization. This insight sheds light on Freud's subjective division between assimilated European scientist and racialized Jewish subject. Edward Said calls this second dimension of Freud's subjectivity non-European, since it functioned as the repressed for Freud, and it explains, for example, his racist projections onto so-called primitives. Let us simply recall the subtitle of Freud's Totem and Taboo: Resemblances between the psychic lives of savages and neurotics. That subtitle, which can be seen on the cover of the 1918 English translation by A.A. Brill, was later removed, censored, repressed from the cover of the translation by James Strachey, the editor of the standard edition of the Complete Psychological Works. As Bakken shows, Freud's secularization of Jewish mysticism was a practical response to the heightened anti-Semitism of his time, particularly in 1882. Freud's self-censorship was a survival strategy in the face of the collective racist enjoyment commanded by the superegoic anti-Semitic other. I also read Freud's secularization of Jewish mysticism as a defense mechanism to both fortify his European ego and disown his Jewish unconscious. Freud faced his Jewish unconscious head-on in his last book, Moses and Monotheism. And it is for this reason that Said, who enjoys late style, returns to this text at the end of his life to highlight Freud's radicalism, such as his emphasis on non-identity politics, a praxis of affiliative solidarity. To say that Moses, the founder of Judaism, is Egyptian means that politics is the grounding of identity and not the other way around. To put it in Lacanian terms, non-identity politics eschews imaginary identifications, the essence of any form of nationalism, in favor of a politics of desire and enjoyment. In other words, comrades are in solidarity not because they are the same, but because they want and enjoy similar things: healthcare, education, public transportation. The praxis of liberation entails a process away from hierarchical, oppressive, violent systems and toward egalitarian forms of power. Freud's free clinics are the best example of the radical politics of psychoanalysis as decolonial atheism. For there is no social justice without psychic justice and vice versa. In my view, the urgent task today for psychoanalysis as decolonial atheism is centering the pluriversal ontologies and epistemologies of non-European or indigenous, Black, and global Southern subjects. We must ask ourselves, is my use of psychoanalysis furthering or undoing the logic of racial capitalism? Decolonial atheism as a method delinks psychoanalytic modernity from psychoanalytic coloniality. The former is humanistic, the latter is racist. The key then is keeping modernity, but expanding it through non-European worlding, while excising coloniality, which is the psychic remainder of colonialism. If we choose to commit to radical psychoanalysis, then our undertaking entails fidelity to decolonial atheism as a transmodern methodology of delinking. Transmodernity combines the best of modernity and its alterity, particularly when it comes to questions of psychosocial justice, such as how social oppression is linked to psychic repression. I will say more later about the colonial logic, which functions as the unconscious of psychoanalysis, but for now, let's turn to the psychoanalysis of racism. Psychoanalysis is a powerful tool for both theorizing unconscious racism and practicing anti-racism. In this section, I will share some of my thoughts on the psychoanalysis of racism. However, I will not perform an exhaustive survey of the literature since I wish to raise specific points instead. Also, I want to highly recommend the excellent book Internal Racism, which is written by my esteemed respondent, Fakhry Davids. In Internal Racism, Davids does not merely apply psychoanalysis to racism, rather he analytically works through the internal racism which surfaces in the clinic in order to theorize this phenomenon that affects us all. Similarly, I have written elsewhere, consciousness raising is important, but it will not succeed without unconsciousness raising, which is a political intervention at the level of the other's discourse. In other words, to be anti-racist, one has to also speak of an anti-racist unconscious, which implies transforming the culture of racism and replacing it with an anti-racist culture. To put it differently, the subject cannot be anti-racist as long as the other is racist. The paradoxical question of racism is, how do we acknowledge human and cultural differences beyond racial categories without being colorblind? In other words, we must collectively come to terms with both the denial of racism, which is also a denial of colonialism, and the overpresence of racial discourses as an effect of religious, scientific, and cultural racisms. We do not yet have a post-racial language, and we may not have one anytime soon, since undoing modernity coloniality may take hundreds of years, but we can at least try to prefigure a transmodern decolonial world system through our liberation praxis. Theorizing unconscious racism. If we accept Jacques Lacan's axiom that the unconscious is the discourse of the other, then we can theorize unconscious racism as the discourse of the racist other. In other words, unconscious racism is a psychosocial phenomenon that is located in the phantasmatic link between the subject and the other. Therefore, anti-racism cannot be reduced exclusively to the psychic level of the subject. To put it differently, racism exists not because racist individuals exist, but because racism enshrines the inequality required by capitalism as a Cartesian coordinate system. The ideology of racism is comprised of two parts. One, racist discourses, and two, racist fantasies. The materiality of racism is a function of enacting the racist ideology on two levels, the individual level and the institutional level. But what is race? According to Alana Lentin, race is a technology for the measurement of human difference, the main goal of which is the production, reproduction, and maintenance of white supremacy on both a local and a planetary scale. She adds, race is about the delineation not only of whites from non-whites, but of the essence of Europeanness from that of non-Europeanness. Therefore, race is above all else a project of colonial distinction and a system of legitimation to justify oppressive and discriminatory practices. Subsequently, the technology of race is ipso facto racist. The anti-racist challenge then is accounting for human difference without falling into the hierarchical trap of managing human difference, which Davids qualifies as a paranoid us versus them construction. For Davids, this paranoid construction is part of normal neurotic psychosexual development, and his name for this defensive system is internal racist organization. The function of the internal racist organization is to reduce the anxiety that results from human difference, particularly along the racial axis. The racial axis is Aníbal Quijano's term for how the idea of race was used by the Spanish conquistadors in the 15th century as part of their modern model of power. In other words, the idea of race made possible the definition of the modern racializing subject, i.e., the universal subject of psychoanalysis, in contradistinction from the colonized, racialized object who was positioned as inferior on the basis of arbitrary markers of human difference, consequently managed by the supposedly superior subject. What rendered these arbitrary categorizations a technology of colonial domination was their definition by the European colonizers, followed by their deployment of said categories as instruments of basic social classification. These dynamics constitute the unconscious of psychoanalysis, or what Davids characterizes as the psychoanalytic silence on race. I have explained the silence earlier in terms of Freud's secularization or repression of Jewish mysticism in the context of late 19th century anti-Semitic Vienna. But Freud's other defense, which supports the thesis of internal racism, is the displacement of his Jewish unconscious onto non-European savages, thereby splitting his non-Europeanness and projecting it elsewhere, outside his psyche, so he can feel less anxious. Therefore, working with racism entails working with anxiety around human difference, which is exacerbated by the apparatus of racial capitalism, since it thrives on inequality. Hence, why it manages human difference through the technology of race and the surplus enjoyment of racism. As Jacques-Alain Miller puts it, racism is founded on what one imagines about the other's jouissance. It is hatred of the particular way of the other's own way of experiencing jouissance. In other words, we are commanded to enjoy racism, mostly unconsciously, and there is no way of ending this form of libidinal economy without abolishing the political economy of racial capitalism. If abolishing racial capitalism is not possible in the foreseeable future, then how can we turn our clinics and institutions into anti-racist and anti-capitalist spaces? Accordingly, practicing anti-racism must involve two strategies. One, a critique of the racist ideology, and two, an anti-racist, anti-capitalist material praxis. The critique of the racist ideology entails theoretical critiques of both racist discourses and racist fantasies. In other words, the purpose here is to show how racism works ideologically in an effort to dismantle it. And in this realm, psychoanalysis has a lot to offer. For example, racist discourses tend to manifest in at least one of three forms: the master's discourse, the university discourse, and the capitalist discourse. The first form is the most dominant one, wherein racism is embedded ideologically so as to appear commonsensical on all levels of society. This is typically the ideological position of the state. Therefore, we can call this form institutional racism. The second form supports the first one, and we can label it scientific racism. It can be overt in its indexing of pseudoscientific 19th century ideas from eugenics on human difference, or it may be covert in its reliance on more contemporary concepts from psychology or psychoanalysis that supposedly explain human difference through a focus on intelligence or development. The third form capitalizes on racism, particularly as a type of surplus enjoyment. This third form, in many ways, is the most ambivalent one because it involves contradictory passions. That is not only phobic, but also philic dimensions. The phobic dimension is the dimension of hate when it comes to racism, but the philic dimension is that of love. The philic dimension may come across as a celebration of multiculturalism, for example, but it typically sutures cultural difference through two-dimensional stereotypical and paranoid representations, such as the good Muslim versus the bad Muslim. The phobic dimension tends to manifest in terms of prejudice or discrimination, that is, in terms of hateful affects or acts, respectively. Cultural racism, or racism without races, is ideologically supported by both institutional racism and scientific racism. In sum, within the apparatus of racial capitalism, racism is structured through three nodes: institutional racism, scientific racism, and cultural racism. Therefore, in addition to critiquing the ideology of racism in its many forms, we must also engage in an anti-racist, anti-capitalist material praxis, which is how we disrupt the surplus enjoyment generated by racism. Anti-racist, anti-capitalist material praxis is the name for our solidarity, or comradeship with others who also wish to live in a world beyond racial capitalism. So in a sense, this praxis involves prefiguring this desired world in our relationships today with our analysans, our colleagues. Again, the free clinics are a good example here. Anti-racism is the question of accounting for human or cultural difference while bracketing the Cartesian coordinates of racial capitalism, which position us on the basis of a hierarchy of difference. For this reason, learned ignorance, as opposed to crass ignorance, is a central feature of anti-racist, anti-capitalist material praxis. Lacan characterized learned ignorance as a passion which is linked to knowledge. I define learned ignorance as a critical epistemological attitude of knowing that we do not know, as opposed to thinking that we know, when our knowledge, in many cases, is but an internalization of colonial epistemology. Colonial epistemology is a racist epistemology grounded in crass ignorance, for the most part, particularly as far as non-Europeans are concerned. As such, I regard learned ignorance as a central feature of psychoanalysis as decolonial atheism. Psychoanalysis is a discipline located in a particular material history. Psychoanalytic clinics and institutions are also operating under specific ideological conditions. Therefore, it is vital to think of the oppressive dimensions of psychoanalysis as a function of its being a Euromodern project invented around the time of new imperialism. Psychoanalysis did not materialize out of thin air in the late 19th century. This discipline's beginning coincides with the birth of psychology as a scientific discipline, separate from philosophy and theology. From the ancient Greeks onwards, the psyche in both psychoanalysis and psychology used to be understood as the soul, the breath of life, spirit, or even al-nafs in Arabic. The definition of psyche changed in the late 19th century to mean mind. Since the 20th century, psyche has come to be conceptualized as behavior and brain. In other words, Freud was part of a human scientific movement dedicated to the empirical study of psyche. Therefore, Freud was building on a humanistic tradition with origins in philosophy. He learned about this tradition first and foremost from Franz Brentano, who also taught Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. Brentano, of course, wrote Psychology from an empirical standpoint, which was published in 1874, or 21 years before Freud and Breuer's studies in hysteria. Certainly, more can be said about the intellectual genealogy that influenced Freud and led to the beginning of psychoanalysis. However, my point here is to historicize and theorize the modern unconscious vis-a-vis colonialism and coloniality. Colonialism is the material colonization of peoples and their resources, land, water, oil. Coloniality is the psychic remainder of the system, which is not a historical event, but rather an ongoing structure that manifests as either settler colonialism, franchise colonialism, or neo-colonialism. My effort, as I shall say more later, is not merely to critique psychoanalysis, but more importantly, to world it through exteriority. This intervention is a further development of some of my ideas in decolonial psychoanalysis, as well as Freud and Said. My question now is, what is on the other side of the cogito? This is a question about the beginning of the modern unconscious. Christopher Columbus did not discover the Americas in 1492. By the same token, Breuer and Freud did not discover the unconscious in 1895. Freud is credited to have said, the poets and philosophers before me discovered the unconscious. What I discovered was the scientific method by which the unconscious can be studied. In other words, Freud is the first to theorize the modern unconscious. Some attribute the invention of the unconscious to Schelling or Nietzsche, but Descartes undoubtedly provided the philosophical foundation for the modern unconscious. I want to pause for a moment on this image of Freud the Conquistador, which is an intriguing identification. In a letter to Wilhelm Fliess on February 1st, 1900, Freud wrote, "I am by temperament nothing but a conquistador, an adventurer, if you want it translated, with all the curiosity, daring, and tenacity characteristic of a man of this sort." There's also, of course, Freud's use of archaeology as a metaphor for what analysts do during construction or reconstruction as opposed to interpretation. Freud is a psychic adventurer, but what is he digging for? What is the psychic equivalent of gold? The answer, of course, is feces. Ranjana Khanna shows that the so-called discovery of material and psychic dark continents is a question of not only exploitation and alienation, but also accumulation and fungibility. Quote, "Psychoanalysis is a colonial discipline, a colonial intellectual formation, disciplines a way of being as much as it establishes a form of analysis based in the age of colonialism and constitutive of concepts of the primitive against which the civilizing mission could establish itself. It brought into the world an idea of being that was dependent on colonial political and ontological relations. And through its disciplinary practices, formalized and perpetuated an idea of uncivilized, primitive, concealed, and timeless colonized peoples. As a discipline, it formalized strategies to normalize a form of civilized being constituted through colonial political dynamics. In the space between the Earth and the colonizing world of late 19th and early 20th century Europe, a national colonial self was brought into existence, or perhaps more accurately, into unconcealment. And it situated itself with fascination in opposition to its repressed, concealed, and mysterious dark continents, colonial Africa, women, and the primitive." End quote. Justin Clemens explores the relationship between psychoanalysis and slavery, or the importance of symbolic slavery in Lacanian psychoanalysis in particular. Clemens writes that the problem of slavery, or the biopolitical problem of the genesis of irreparable inequality, is at the center of the psychoanalytic project. He adds, quote, "As Lacan says, we analysts deal with slaves who think they are masters. Mastery is thus an imaginary function. Slavery is a symbolic one. The subject is a subject insofar as it subsists in a state of servitude, servitude to the signifier." End quote. However, I must ask, what of the real of slavery? Is that the repressed unconscious of psychoanalysis, a source of its jouissance? We of course know about the analyst's desire, which Bruce Fink describes as purified desire, or a desire that focuses on analysis and only on analysis. He also calls it the motor force of analysis. Nevertheless, is the psychoanalytic clinic an acontextual space, or is it a psychosocial space that is linked with what is going on materially and ideologically in the world? Is the practice of psychoanalysis ahistorical, or is it a function, an effect of a specific historical unfolding? I ask these questions in order to think about not only the analyst's desire, but also the jouissance of analysis, which is rarely theorized. The metaphorization of slavery, or psychoanalysis qua symbolic slavery, seems to me like a defense against the traumatic real of slavery, which is not properly historicized in relation to psychoanalysis. The following passage from Saida Hartman sheds light on the excess jouissance, which makes desire for the modern subject of psychoanalysis possible. Quote, "The relation between pleasure and the possession of slave property in both the figurative and literal senses can be explained in part by the fungibility of the slave. That is, the joy made possible by virtue of the replaceability and interchangeability endemic to the commodity, and by the extensive capacities of property. That is, the augmentation of the master subject through his embodiment in external objects and persons. Put differently, the fungibility of the commodity makes the captive body an abstract and empty vessel, vulnerable to the projection of others' feelings, ideas, desires, and values. And as property, the dispossessed body of the enslaved is the surrogate for the master's body, since it guarantees his disembodied universality and acts as the sign of his power and dominion. Thus, while the beaten and mutilated body presumably establishes the brute materiality of existence, the materiality of suffering regularly eludes recognition by virtue of the bodies being replaced by other signs of value, as well as other bodies. Thus, the desire to don, occupy, or possess blackness, or the black body as a sentimental resource and or locus of excess enjoyment is both founded upon and enabled by the material relations of chattel slavery," end quote. So how did psychoanalysis get here to this excess enjoyment? I argue that it is a function of the Cartesian modern unconscious. As Slavoj Žižek puts it, the subject of psychoanalysis is none other than the Cartesian cogito. In other words, the modern subject of psychoanalysis, who is divided between being and thinking, is the inverse of the Cartesian formulation, cogito ergo sum. I say the inverse because the modern subject is divided between their false being, articulated in the illusion of ego mastery, and their unconscious thought, which overlap in the body, but only in theory. Having said that, the inverted subject of psychoanalysis is not a universal subject. Rather, he is a particular subject who is posited as universal. In writing about modern subjectivity, Žižek does not hide what is obvious to him. The excremental subject of modernity is a Christian European man. He writes, quote, "Modern subjectivity is not announced in the Renaissance humanist celebration of man as the crown of creation, but rather in Luther's famous statement that man is the excrement who fell out of the god's anus. The ontic equivalent of the modern subject is inherently excremental. There is no subjectivity proper without the notion that at a different level, from another perspective, I am a mere piece of shit." End quote. Identity or particularity, on the other hand, is for the other. Dolar asks, is there an unconscious outside of cogito? He answers in the negative following Lacan. I answer in the affirmative, the transmodern unconscious. Mapping this other unconscious necessitates a decolonial conception of space, a counter-cartography beyond the Cartesian coordinate system, which fixes us as a point in a two-dimensional hierarchy. Racial capitalism is this Cartesian coordinate system, whose castrating power is generated through the following two axes. The horizontal or ideological axis of sexual difference, and the vertical or material axis of colonial difference. Sexual difference is marked by the heteropatriarchal oppression of Euromodern women or woman as other, and colonial difference is premised on arbitrary set violence against non-Europeans as the other of the other. Class struggle exists in a liminal space between these two. The subject of psychoanalysis, Dolar adds, is the subject of modern science. He continues, for being empty, it can be universal, and it can indeed be seen as the form of subjectivity implied by science, a merely formal subjectivity. I aim to problematize this universal or merely formal subjectivity while confirming Dolar's assertion that the Freudian unconscious is the unconscious of cogito. Finally, Dolar asks, how does the subject of the unconscious as cogito relate to jouissance? I would like to historicize this question in the context of European colonialism. Unlike Dolar, and as you shall hear in a moment, Zizek, I believe that the alienation and non-being of the colonized subject is not a psychical metaphor, but a real historical materiality. In fact, one could argue that the cogito's literal assault on the being of non-Europeans is one of the essential features of colonialism. The colonial unconscious is this very unthinkability of the non-European. What historians call new imperialism, or the period in European colonialism between 1875 and 1914, is another ideological context for the founding of psychoanalysis as a discipline. We are currently living in the era of humanitarian imperialism, which is a variation on the civilizing mission. However, to understand the development of European colonialism, we must return to what Ramon Grossfogel labels the four genocides and epistemicides in the long 16th century, since that tragic history sheds light on the unconscious of psychoanalysis. First, against Muslims and Jews and the conquest of Al-Andalus in the name of purity of blood. Second, against indigenous peoples, first in the Americas and then in Asia. Third, against African people with the captive trade and their enslavement in the Americas. Fourth, against women who were accused of being witches and then burned alive. These four genocides, epistemicides, were essentially against peoples who were perceived as pre-modern and uncivilized savages, and as unthinkable non-beings as far as the cogito was concerned. As such, non-Europeans were positioned as outside the universal subjectivity of modern science. However, my point is that non-Europeans are neither external barbarians nor primitives stuck in tradition. Rather, they are exterior to modernity, which denotes a dialectical or extimate relation. What is of concern to us today is that in the analytical experience, there is an oppressed person, the psychoanalyzed, whose need for communication is exploited, and who, in the same way as the witches could under torture only repeat the language that the inquisitors wanted to hear, has no other choice than to attempt to say what she is supposed to say. This oppression is a function of psychoanalysis as colonial secularism, which ideologically negates the being and thinking of non-Europeans. But why? The colonial unconscious is the logic sustaining the rhetoric of the modern unconscious. Therefore, to unravel the unconscious of psychoanalysis, we must conduct a genealogy of the cogito. Enrique Dussel and Grossfogel after him showed that the ego cogito of the 17th century was structured upon the ego conquiro of the 15th century. Dussel writes, the I conquistador, or ego conquiro, forms the proto-history of Cartesian ego cogito and constitutes its own subjectivity as will to power. Grossfogel posits an ego extermino in the 16th century. For Zizek, the Cartesian subject from the 17th century to this day is the monster who remains when we subtract from the subject the wealth of self-experience that constitutes subjectivity. The Cartesian or modern subject of psychoanalysis is a dehumanizing subject, a monster who has not come to terms with the real of coloniality. Consequently, this negated monstrosity is projected onto the colonized, the enslaved, the overexploited, and the sexually oppressed. This projection This blaming of the victims, along with the negation of the being and thinking of non-Europeans, demarcate the line between the zone of being and the zone of non-being, or between the modern unconscious and the colonial unconscious. Liberation then necessitates a different type of subjectivity, one that can account equally for the humanity of both Europeans and non-Europeans. I call it transmodern or contrapuntal subjectivity, and Freud exemplified it even when he did not always embody it in his writings. Transmodern subjectivity accounts for both modernity and its alterity, and it does so from the perspective of decoloniality, which is the name for any critical methodology that delinks coloniality from modernity. Modernity is the baby worth saving. Coloniality is the bathwater to be thrown away. Dussel provides us with a powerful model for how to enact this delinking through what he calls the new transmodern system, which is exterior to the totality of the modern system, and yet integrates this totality in a way that supersedes the efforts of postmodern and critical modern approaches. For him, an innovative transmodernity is constructed from the synthesis of three elements: the innovative interpolation before modernity, the subsumption of modernity's positivity, and the affirmation of the other in its exteriority. Dussel's model is a critique of approaches that either name the limit of modernity but stop there, or that aim to assimilate the other into the same old system. In this final section, I will argue for the worlding of psychoanalysis through both an immanent critique and a decolonial reading. The first approach critiques psychoanalysis from within its own logic in an effort to emphasize its radical potential. The second approach critiques psychoanalysis from without through the lens of the non-European other. Ultimately, the dialectical move is to be able to both appreciate what psychoanalysis has to offer us today in terms of theory and practice, while also critiquing the false universality of ethnocentric psychoanalytic notions. By using the term worlding, I am for one indexing Said's notion of worldliness, which signifies that texts, including this one, are part of the social world, human life, and of course, the historical moments in which they are located and interpreted. In other words, psychoanalytic texts are always situated. However, with worlding, I'm also invoking Frantz Fanon's practice of stretching theory, which I see as a move from ethnocentrism to world-centrism, with the caveat that I believe, following Paulo Freire, in the leadership of the oppressed, the racialized, and the proletariat. This essay has been one attempt of stretching psychoanalysis beyond its comfort zone in Euromodernity in order to shed light on the zone of non-being, the unspeakable, the real of coloniality. Is it a traumatic zone? And who is more qualified to confront trauma than psychoanalysts? An immanent critique of psychoanalysis means critiquing the praxis from within its own logic. As such, it involves reflexivity on the part of the psychoanalytic practitioner and or theorist. I also think of immanent critique as a critique grounded in love. I would not spend so much time and effort critiquing something I did not care about. A decolonial reading of psychoanalysis is an engagement with the praxis from without, particularly through the lens of decoloniality. As such, I would like to end my essay by highlighting the work of a few non-European theorists on a further division of psychoanalytic subjectivity, or what I call double unconsciousness. I begin with Moroccan philosopher Abdelkibir Khatibi in his concept of other thought. For Khatibi, other thought is planetary and plural. It embodies difference that struggles against its own reduction and domestication. Other thought is a promise, the sign of a happening in a world to be transformed. It is an endless task involving ruptures. The duty of an other thought, according to Khatibi, is to broaden our freedom to think. Further, Khatibi adds that other thought is about decentering Western knowledge within ourselves. To be decolonized, he writes, would be the other name of this other thought, and decolonization would be the silent completion of Western metaphysics. And this is where begins the third speech, this unbinding of Western reason. Caliban's reason is Paget Henry's name for this third speech, or this unbinding of Western reason. In his book on Africana philosophy, Henry highlights the work of two Black theorists in particular, who wrote extensively on this other reason, C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter. James rejected the Cartesian formulation cogito ergo sum, which, as you may recall, is essential for psychoanalysis. James's counter formulation is, I undertake or participate in a historical project, therefore I am. Henry argues that Jamesian subjectivity is grounded in traditional African thought, where the thinking or speaking subject was not conceived on the solitary Cartesian model. On the contrary, as Mabiti suggests, it is more a case of I am because we are, since we are, therefore I am. Furthermore, Henry asserts that Winter reformulates the vertical drama of ego consciousness as one of cogito consciousness. That is, whether or not, as human beings, we'll be able to increase significantly our consciousness of and control over the autopoietic processes that ground our discursive practices. Winter's theorization makes explicit this process of shadow creation through the analysis of the liminal categories of epistemes. This shadow creation is the colonial unconscious, which psychoanalysis and any other Euromodern discourse must reckon with. Ultimately, Winter's critique of Western reason culminates in the introduction of a qualitatively new episteme, one that will give us greater control over the misrepresentations that have undermined horizontal projects of emancipation. Henry concludes his book by naming Africana philosophy as one example of Caliban's reason, a radical praxis of other thought. In my research, I have come to develop what I call double unconsciousness, inspired, of course, by W.E.B. Du Bois's theory of double consciousness. I argue that non-European subjects are doubly divided because they're not only barred by the rhetoric of modernity, they're also barred by the logic of coloniality. As such, I contend that the apparatus of racial capitalism is structured not only sexual difference, but also colonial difference. Whereas sexual difference is a function of the developmental drama known as the Oedipus complex, colonial difference is an effect of the historical tragedy of colonization. The drama of sexual difference interpolates us as either man or woman, a binary regime which is inherently hierarchical and therefore oppressive. In this heteropatriarchal order of sexual difference, the phallus is not only a signifier of desire, but also of power. The tragedy of colonial difference, on the other hand, is marked by arbitrary set violence between human and non-human, civilized and savage. It is the colonial logic behind every genocide in history. Consequently, double unconsciousness implies the existence of two others. For this reason, we must resurrect the Lacanian concept of the other, to give it new meaning. For Lacan, at one point in his work, the other of the other is the universal name of the Father, the signifier of signifiers, or the other as transcendent law. In Subjectivity and Otherness, Lorenzo Chiesa asserts that Lacan deems modernity to be special insofar as it founds itself on a symbolic other of the other, which is another way of saying that history begins with modernity, wherein the incest taboo signifies the prohibition of that which is exterior to modernity. Pre-modernity, on the other hand, is constructed retroactively, that is, from the perspective of modernity, as prehistory, pre-thinking, non-being. According to Chiesa, the universal other of the other, or the birth of the symbolic as such, is Lacan's mythical equivalent to Freud's Oedipus complex. Whereas the former is historical, the latter is developmental. Both are equally problematic, as it's clear from how, for example, the model of psychosexual development is projected onto non-European nation states, which are often described in infantilizing terms as developing or underdeveloped without taking into account the long-term effects of colonization. For instance, psychoanalysis would not have been possible as a practice without the background of exploitation, extraction, accumulation, dispossession, etc. Therefore, I argue for the primacy of colonial difference over sexual difference. My thesis finds support in a recent work of Paul Preciado, a trans man who challenges what he calls the regime of sexual difference, a binary ideology reinforced by psychoanalysis, which he characterizes as colonial and heteropatriarchal, for it pathologizes non-binary subjectivities as abnormal, if not psychotic. After Seminar 5, Lacan abandons his conception of the other, and in fact reverses his position by saying that there is no other of the other, which is his way of killing the symbolic father. The statement, there is no other of the other, signifies that there is no meta-language, or that there is no symbolic without the real, and vice versa. To put it differently, Lacan's problem with his own structuralist account is that the other of the other presupposes a purely external real. Nevertheless, does not the modern subject presuppose a purely external or barbarian real outside of modernity, an exotic source of infinite jouissance from the point of view of racial capitalism? In sum, the modern other is the universal name of the father par excellence. I agree with Lacan that there is no meta-language, but my argument throughout has been that there is an other system exterior to modernity, which is negated by it, and yet is dialectically related to it. What Dussel calls transmodernity. Transmodernity is the key to theorizing and practicing decolonial subjectivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was a tour de force. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You deserve a glass of water.
Yeah, I think I'm dehydrated right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So we're going to take a short break now. We're going to come back at 10 past in about 7 minutes, and we'll continue with Fakhry's response.
Sounds
So see you all shortly. Thank you. Hello, Fakhry, can you hear me? I think,
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear?
yes, I can hear you as well. Yes, well,
Yeah, okay.
Robert, are you still there? Nice, stepped away. Maybe we'll just give it another minute for people to come back, Fakhry, and then we'll begin.
Yeah, Robert's not back yet, is he?
Mm. Just having a look at the chat, and there's some very very nice responses to Robert's paper. Alfonso Williams, excellent presentation, Robert, with a fire emoji. Dharma Paul, coruscating, Robert, thank you. Just for people to know, we've had interest in this seminar today from across the world. I mean, the majority of our attendees are from the UK, but quite a number also from the US and Canada, and Ghana, New Zealand, really the entire globe is tuned in, so that's very exciting. So I think we will start again. Welcome back, everyone. See Robert joined us as well. So next we have Fakhry Davids, who's going to present the response to Robert's paper. But just before we move on, I just wanted to say, colleagues and I have had a little think about the timing today, and we may have underestimated how much time we might need. So if it's okay, we might just run on to about 5:15, do so. And as Fiona mentioned at the start, there is a recording of the seminar, and that'll be made available to everybody shortly. So I'd like to warmly welcome Fakhry Davids. Fakhry is often introduced as someone who doesn't need an introduction. Many of you will know that Fakhry is a training analyst of the British Psychoanalytical Society, and author of the seminal book, Internal Racism, a psychoanalytic approach to race and difference, published in 2011. There you go, thanks, Robert. Fakhry, as you know, a key part of what we're doing with this series is bringing academic and clinical work into dialogue. And I wonder, in relation to your own approach to theory and practice, and also in relation to your journey from apartheid South Africa to live and work in this country, what you might want to say about this wish of ours to create this kind of seminar?
Thank you very much, Anshu. I think it's admirable of the Guild to try and put together this kind of conversation. The presentation by Robert, as you've said yourself, was a tour de force. And I'd like to begin by thanking him for his erudite and stimulating presentation. I'd also like to thank Robert for his generous acknowledgement of my own work. It really is a pleasure to be here with him. We come from opposite ends of Africa, He from Cairo, I from Cape Town. And the link between Cape Town and Cairo is immortalized in a way by the ambition of Cecil John Rhodes, that archetypal colonialist, to create a railway, the Cape to Cairo link. This was his ambition. And one can sort of see the colonial agenda sort of very much inscribed in that. But it's a real pleasure to be here with Robert, because of course, both of us from our different places in Africa have first-hand experience of the impact that colonialism and the post-colonial ideology makes on one's subjectivity and the difficulties that it poses for us to become ourselves. And both of us, of course, now live within the dominant West. He in the United States and I in the United Kingdom, where I've been for some 40 years or so. So that the difficulties we're trying to address are very close to the bone for both of us personally. Now, it's very clear that Robert is steeped in the study and scrutiny of psychoanalysis from within the academic intellectual tradition, which is a specialized practice of its own, usually very far removed from those of us who are involved in clinical practice in a day-to-day way. Clinicians will know how engrossing that business is and how it keeps your mind occupied in the vicissitudes of what happens in your own private consulting room. So we owe scholars in that tradition a great deal for working out the ways in which forces beyond the individual, broadly conceptualized as historical, ideological forces, actually exert a formative influence on all of us, and how difficult it is to break free of that. And of course, it's in that context that I welcomed Anshu, the Guild's attempt to try and bring these two traditions together in some kind of dialogue. Now, Robert's presentation chucked my way a whole lot of concepts that are completely new to me, and that it would take me a long time to sort of try and assimilate, make sure that I understand what is meant by that, and then try and locate it in relation to the concepts that I do use and that are familiar to me. So you have to forgive me if my response to Robert is not all that his scholarship deserves. When I first read the paper, I became afraid that I'd bitten off more than I can chew. I certainly couldn't do justice to the richness of what he's put before us. And of course, it would be even more difficult to do it in a short response. But nor am I convinced that had I the time, I would have enough time, I'd be able to do it justice. And then, of course, I remembered that when we talked about it, the aim was not to kind of do Robert's analysis justice, but to open up a discussion between a scholar such as him and those of us who operate mainly clinically. So it's in that context that you have to take the few words that I have to say. I'm grateful, of course, to you and Ivan and your organizing committee for the opportunity to do so. Robert reminds us that the body of theory that we've inherited from the founders of psychoanalysis scotomizes the experience of the colonial subject. He goes to some lengths to show us that the historical context with which psychoanalysis emerged is the very same one in which, in the real material world, the practices of European imperialism and colonialism were at their height. And he suggests that this reality is present within psychoanalytic discourse in the form of an I hope this is not too banal a way of talking about it, an unacknowledged other. Now, Robert locates the discussion within the general tradition of psychoanalytic critique that developed from the work of Lacan. In that way of thinking, what is unacknowledged or disavowed doesn't disappear, but is present as something other within the discourse that indeed does surface. And that can be revealed through the practice of critique and deconstruction. That, of course, is never complete. The ego constantly produces what Lacan sees as illusory solutions, whose aim is to provide comfort rather than help us to face uncomfortable truth, the naked truth, fully. Now, that broad perspective I have found to be deeply illuminating. For example, through the work of Juliet Mitchell, the approach deepened our understanding of the Oedipus complex as a way that illuminates how the gendered other of phallocentric discourse comes to be installed internally. And that piece of work rescued psychoanalytic theory at a time it could have succumbed to legitimate feminist critiques, and enriched it as a means of revealing layers of complexity that belong to individuals' struggles with these matters. I believe it also brought more robustness to the theory that we've inherited from Freud. And I suggested that the Lacanian rereading, we should say, renders superfluous Freud's need to what he called his anthropological fantasy of the primal horde. That's Freud's term. It revealed the profound ways in which phallocentrism in the form of male chauvinism is normalized and its other perpetually excluded. Now, I do believe that that work helped to lay the foundation for psychoanalytic training institutions, and psychotherapeutic ones too, to become less homophobic over the years, a process that is still very much in train. For example, today, most psychoanalytic and psychotherapeutic trainings explicitly have equal opportunities statements formally enshrined in their constitutions. That didn't used to be the case before. Now, I was therefore very interested in trying to think whether the perspectives Robert presents might help us as clinicians struggling to accommodate the lived experience of the objects of racist discourse, the descendants, in other words, of colonial subjects of yesteryear, to incorporate some of that into our thinking and our work. Perhaps a starting point in this conversation might be something that Robert refers to as the 4 genocides of, and I quote from his paper, the long 16th century. For that painful history can shed light on the unconscious of psychoanalysis. First, against Muslims and Jews in the conquest of Al-Andalus in the name of, quote, purity of blood, close quote. Second, against indigenous peoples, first in the Americas and then in Asia. Third, against African people with the captives trade and their enslavement in the Americas. Fourth, against women who were accused of being witches and then burnt alive. Robert continues, these 4 genocides, epistemicides, were essentially against peoples who were perceived as pre or non-modern, that is, savages, primitives, barbarians, etc. They constitute the irrational non-beings cancelled by the Euromodern cogito. Therefore, they are positioned as outside to the merely formal subjectivity of modern science. In short, psychoanalysis by design excludes non-European subjects, close quotes. Now, I have a personal example of the impact of that othering. In my third year studying psychology at Cape Town University, we read Civilization and Its Discontents. And the paper I thought was absolutely brilliant because Freud casts the net wide and chooses to position the discipline of subject, the psychoanalysis, in relation to the civilizing quotes process, so that the title of, it sort of lives up to that. And it all went swimmingly to me as I read that. And then I came across a jarring reference to primitive people. And I couldn't read any further. Who is he talking about? I thought. And as I read on, it became clear that he was talking about people like me, people like us in places like Africa. And that completely turned me off psychoanalysis for a long, long time. I thought I couldn't be part of a discipline that does that by, as Robert says, by design excludes non-European subjects. And the situation was only remedied for me a few years later when I discovered the work of Frantz Fanon, who in fact describes the experience of these same subjects of colonialism, but in a very different way. And of course, as you'll know, Fanon looked to a certain kind of psychoanalysis to illuminate that. And by comparison to what he was looking for, what he found completely lacking and not up to the task. And it was the idea, Fanon's idea, that there was a kind of psychoanalysis that could do something to articulate that difficulty that brought me back, into the fold, so to speak. Now, I want to continue with that quote I just gave you a bit further on. Robert continues with Ross Feugel, quotes, what links the I conquer, therefore I am, that's the conquistador mentality, with the idolatric, godlike, I think, therefore I am, is the epistemic racism, sexism produced by the, quotes, I exterminate, therefore I am. You'll remember that portion of Robert's paper, and he says, it's the logic of genocide, epistemicide, together that mediates the I conquer with the epistemic racism of this and sexism of the I think as the foundation, the new foundation of knowledge in the modern colonial world. Now that, to my mind, brings in murder of the racialized other into the general practice of psychoanalysis. I've developed that notion further, not in the way, in a way that's sort of linked to theory close to psychoanalytic practice, to say something like this, that in the mind, every mind, one finds a structure at the core of which is something murderous towards what I call a racial other. So that conception, I think, chimes with the broader kind of canvas on which Robert puts this analysis. And it begins from that starting point, that there is a murdered other that is part of all of us, and that it is psychoanalysis has scotomized that. It simply erases that by erasing the subject that is murdered by colonial practice, one might say. Now, I can't, there's no time to go into all of that, but that's sort of the way I've come at this. Now you can see, coming from someone like me, there is a sort of an implication that if one can get hold of some of this in an authentic way, in Robert's language, I think, in a way that involves a kind of jouissance, something that involves a real kind of engagement, if one can do that, then I have a sort of optimistic outlook on it. I wanted to ask Robert, when he traces this back to the very origin of psychoanalysis in its European context, that it's an otherness attributed to the colonial subject that is inscribed in psychoanalytic theory itself. Is that kind of racism of psychoanalysis, as you would term it, something that is endemic, that is inherent to psychoanalysis as a practice, and that therefore it is impossible to move beyond? Because it seems to me that my take on it has a sort of optimism in it, not a false optimism, but something that says, if one can engage with this in an authentic way, there is some kind of hope of getting to an ordinary humanism, as Fanon would call it, and so on. So I wanted to leave that as a question that was in my mind. There's many details one could go into, of course, but perhaps I've said enough to get our conversation going. So let me again thank you, Robert, for a very stimulating hour listening to you.
Thank you very much, Fakhry. I appreciate your comments and questions. And we spoke yesterday, and I shared with you how your work has influenced me. Especially, I started years ago looking at Islamophobia from a psychoanalytic perspective, and coming across your work, I didn't find a lot of actually psychoanalytic literature that deals with that topic. So it was illuminating to see you approach it that way. So I thank you for your work. Yeah.
The question that Fakhry just raised, Robert, do you think it's endemic to psychoanalysis? Do you share the measured optimism that if one can get hold of the kinds of concepts, but
Yeah,
in a real and authentic way?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. First of all, I would like to say that my approach is different from the approach of saying, psychoanalysis can be racist or colonialist, etc. Therefore, we should cancel psychoanalysis as a whole. I obviously, you can tell that I even mentioned that I wouldn't waste my time unless I found something valuable there, right? So the point for me is stretching psychoanalysis outside of its comfort zone. And in order to do that, so this comfort zone, we can think of it as the zone of being, to use Fanon's terms. And it's also its location within what are called the apparatus of racial capitalism. Also, we can think of it as a Cartesian coordinate system. So basically a hierarchical structuring system of power, right? That has come to exist in a particular way because of the history that I tried to talk about. So it's not an accident, it's just a development over time. It's harder for us maybe to see it because the brutality is not necessarily as obvious as before, but the brutality continues to exist because colonialism is not a thing of the past. I mean, someone from me who comes from Egypt and looks at the kind of wars in my region, it's an ongoing reality, right? So the question for me really is, how do we dislodge psychoanalysis from this Cartesian coordinate system, from this hierarchical? That's for me, the problem is like, obviously, it's not going to happen like this because it took hundreds of years to establish the system that we're talking about. So it'll probably take hundreds of years to undo it, to be realistic, right? But part of the undoing is to talk about to talk about it, to critique it, to think about how to undo it. And it's really a conversation towards praxis, right, ultimately. So obviously what we're doing, the optimism, these are the baby steps that are needed in order to get there. But will we get there in our lifetime? Probably not.
Fakhry, I wonder whether you feel that the analytic encounter, the specificity of the analytic encounter may actually offer a space where this kind of zone of non-being can be accessed within the containment offered by the analytic dyads, for example.
I mean, I clearly do think that, you know, but Robert's point, you know, about how successfully one can do it, you know, that has to be an open question. It depends on so many factors. But in terms of if you try and conceive what one's trying to do, you know, it is looking at the relationship between, for example, I'll give you an example of it. You know, psychoanalysis is a white discipline. Now, I happen to be a practitioner of color. So when I have a patient who, say, is also somebody of color, it's very tempting for me to work with my, you know, the reality of me being different and to create a kind of coziness in the consulting room where that experience of non-being, of being cancelled out, which that person lives, if you take the analysis that Robert beautifully puts to us, it would say that person lives that in the street out there. How could they not? You see? And then the challenge for us as clinicians is, how do I bring that in? And to do that, I would have to identify with a white colonizing, you know, the discipline that Robert described so beautifully. I'd have to be able to do that. You see, and you can see there's quite a task, emotional task. But for me, it can, at least in that way, one can outline the dimensions of the struggle. And I can identify, you know, ways in which I can or can't do that. And I can try and work on that, you know, and often it involves one's experience that's the object of racism, that you wished you could somehow leave outside the consulting room. So I think we're sort of in the same realm that Robert's talking about, where one is in business, you know, if one can sort of understand it, try and conceptualize it, and stay close to what is real. Then I think it's possible, you know. But how far you can get along that way, one doesn't know, and that is linked also with our conception of psychoanalysis itself, not just in relation to race and class and so on, but that is also the aim of analysis, to open up inner experience as deeply as one can. So I think the practice is amenable to it, but to do it is bloody difficult.
It is hard. I have a question for both of you. I mean, it's interesting the way you began your response, Fakhry, making the link between Egypt and South Africa, and that you've both traveled from these far kind of axes of north and south axes of that place to the US and to the UK.
Right.
And I'm wondering about how that journey, you know, intersects with your experience and of the European cogito, of the Cartesian cogito, that you've seen it at some sense from outside before as well. You know, the exterior view is different. I mean, for example, for somebody like myself who grew up in this country in a Western education, the opportunity to actually kind of open up, and see the cogito from inside, as it were, is a different process. And I wonder, for example, how many members of the guild might imagine, the Cartesian genealogy of the guild's cogito. When we're in the clinic, we're in a clinic. Our reduced-free clinic operates in Lewisham, Southwark, and Lambeth. 3 inner-city London boroughs. The last census said that there was, around 60% of the residents of these 3 boroughs identify as being non-white British. This is the group of people that we are working with. So I wonder if you could say something to us today about how to begin to unearth even a sense of this epistemological experience that when one's already within it, as it were.
Fakhry, would you like to go first, or?
I think let's let Robert.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so it's from what I understood from the question is kind of reflecting on my immigration to the United States as someone that grew up in Egypt and how that influences my thinking. So growing up in Egypt, I experienced othering in a different way than definitely being othered in the US. It wasn't because, in Egypt, I was kind of quote unquote religious minority. So it's a different kind of othering. Whereas in the US, it was more racializing kind of othering. So that has to do with how I speak, how I look, associations with the Middle East, the war on terror, all these kinds of associations, which I talk about in decolonial psychoanalysis. Had a similar moment to Fanon's famous moment on the train when a kid looks at him and calls him the N-word. So I had a similar moment early on many years ago. Someone said, "Oh, look, you look like a terrorist." So it made me think, like, what does a terrorist look like? And why do you think I would look like a terrorist? Right? It's very arbitrary, but that's how racist associations work. They're arbitrary. But the repetition over time in a systemic way consolidates them in a concrete way. And that's how it becomes structural racism. And that's why my first book was on Islamophobia. Even though I'm not Muslim, I still experience Islamophobia as someone that comes from Egypt. So so that's definitely one piece that I was wrestling with on a personal level. And then I wanted to explain theoretically, well, what is the connection between Islamophobia and the war on terror? And that's really the question that drove my first book. So, yeah, I mean, being in the US and then being in solidarity with other folks who are racialized and, seeing the struggle of indigenous folks, Black folks, etc. And then thinking about the history of that struggle. And so it kind of definitely has a big influence on my thinking. And yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Fakhry, I had a question as well. And maybe this is the last one that I'll ask before we move into the Q&A. Robert's paper mentions the philic dimension of racism as distinct from the phobic. And I think that the philic dimension is often underanalyzed by therapists in their own conscious and unconscious racism. Do you have any thoughts about, what kind of colonial projections and objectifications we should think about in regard to how this might affect our work?
I mean, it's so important that, because, you know, it's easy to think of racism in static terms. You know, black people are hated, or Arabs are hated, or, you know, whatever it is. And whilst that's an important observation that exists, of course, the point about racism is that it's a fluid phenomenon, you know, and it's as Robert said so beautifully in his paper, he brings out as a kind of othering that invalidates one. You know, that's at the core of it. And its surface manifestation could be that this is abhorrent, or this is so, you know, so pretty, so in the sense of exotic, isn't this, you know, and both are dehumanizing of the other. And I think there's a different kind of way that one thinks is better, where one looks at the other as an inevitable aspect of oneself. That is, we can't exist without the other. Now, that is to give the other a kind of respect and a kind of status in our being that is central. Now, for example, in this country, Britain, most of our analytic work is done within an object relations framework. And, you know, in that model, one thinks that an object, the other, is absolutely central to our own being. It's sort of fundamental, but that's different to the racialized other, which, you know, it can have either of those other dimensions. And I think that's what Robert's sort of trying to talk about when he thinks of deconstructing the ways in which we have constructed this non-European other and so on. Now, knowing that, understanding that is important to deconstructing it. And for us clinicians, that does mean that one has to look at one's subjectivity as, for example, a white person, a person of color, person of a religious minority, majority, whatever it is. That dynamic is very important to know about. And it's important for our discipline, because on the whole, we don't teach that as integral to our practice as psychoanalysts and psychotherapists. So there's something very, very important. You know, can we extend what we do to incorporate those dimensions? To my mind, unless a therapist or analyst has done some of their work, I don't think they can do the work with the client, with the patient. You know, it's just not possible, because the terrain, you know, that one has to navigate internally is that, as Robert says, it is the terrain of non-being. Either that your being is erased in the way that Fanon does it and talks about it, or that you are complicit in erasing the being of other subjects of these political kind of ideological divides. So you know, somebody was saying, why 100 years? I'm not even sure if in 100 years we would get close to this, but I would hope that more of us would be aware that this is a dimension that needs to be taken seriously. And in order to equip ourselves, you know, there's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. And thank you, Fakhry, for your response. And Robert, we'll move now into some Q&A from our audience. So I'm just having a quick look at the chat, and I can see a question that's come up. Let's have a look, from Gioconda, asking about the meta language. Gioconda, would you like to unmute yourself and maybe ask the question directly? No.
She's muted. The host, I think.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Oh yes, we can hear you now. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Robert, for a very, very stimulating talk. A lot to understand, to think about. I was just curious about what you meant by there is no meta language, as I understood perhaps more in a Foucauldian sense that there is a counter discourse as a kind of meta language from the colonized or the oppressed. I don't know what you meant by there is
Sure.
no meta language.
Well, I mean, this idea comes from Lacan. He talks about there is no meta language in the sense that there's no language outside, the link between the subject and the other with which we can speak about that. So we're always embedded within that relationship. We can't kind of go outside of it. My contention with it, I agree that there is no meta language, but I just say that there is an other language. There is an other system, an other thought, and that other thought, that other system is exterior. So as opposed to outside, because the idea of outside is rooted in the idea of the barbarian. So you have Europe as the center of modernity. Everything outside of that those are the barbarians who are outside. The primitives are those who are stuck in time in the past, pre-modern. So you have these two notions of the savages. One is spatial, one is temporal. So I try to introduce the notion of exteriority to problematize this and to think about the non-European as exterior in the sense of extimate. So they're not outsiders living in some kind of vacuum outside of Europe and modernity, right? I mean, if you think about the history of Al-Andalus, we're talking about something like 700 years of Muslim presence in the heart of Europe, but that history is often repressed or taught in a kind of revisionist way, right? And so this idea of extimacy is a more dialectical notion. So I'm just basically, because ultimately Lacan offers us a lot of useful tools, but he's still situated within European modern thinking. So in a way, I'm using Fanon's practice of stretching theory to think that, okay, there is no meta language, but there is another language. And we can think about, well, what are the dominant languages that are used for the transmission of psychoanalysis, including the one that I'm using now, which is obviously not my mother tongue, right? So we can think about it in that literal, concrete sense. And that obviously links to the cultural sense. What are the languages that are excluded? What are the cultures that are excluded? What are the subjects that are excluded from this conversation? So in a way, Fakhry and I and Anshu have to speak in English to have this conversation about something, as I mentioned, kind of inherently unspeakable. So that's the paradox that we're dealing with.
Mary Jo Peebles says something here. She says the use of the couch is inherently, bracket, structurally, architecturally hierarchical.
That's for Fakhry, I think.
Yeah, Fakhry, you have something to say?
It's a very difficult one because I think what one does there is you sort of hang on to the couch, something that's inherent in a therapeutic relationship, which is hierarchy. You know, somebody comes to you, presumably because they think you have an expertise, that there's something that they're looking for from you. It's called, can you help me with this? Now, it seems to me that's where one starts from. And the process of trying to deconstruct that so that you get to a position that's truer to reality, that it's linked with the way Robert ends his essay, that a patient or a client is a human being. that is having a relationship with another human being. And there is some kind of hope that if this relationship were to be scrutinized, which is what the nature of analysis is, that you get closer to facing truths about what is between you. Yeah, and you can see, so that's my conception of what happen, what the structural relationship between a patient and an analyst is. That's not what most people come with. They come with a, you could say, a colonialist, if you used Robert's way of thinking it, a construction where I am put in the position of a master who knows better and is going to somehow through that relationship impart what would be good for the patient. Now that's completely wrong. But that's how very often you begin. And your job is try and deconstruct it to get closer to the real truth of what your relationship actually is, you see, which is the way I see it, that one has traversed a certain path, and having done that, you might be able to facilitate somebody else traversing their path, and that your paths are not the same. So I put the question about the couch into that sort of construction. And so I don't think it's inherently hierarchical, but I accept it very often is felt to be, and it is seen to be, and that's what has to be worked with. It won't magically change. So that's the way I look at it.
May I add something here, Andrew?
Please.
So I agree that the analyst and analyst relationship doesn't have to be inherently hierarchical. It can be. And I also think of the analyst as playing a certain function as opposed to, being an analyst 24/7, which I think can be a mistake. It becomes ideological if you think you're an analyst 24/7. So it's a function, in the analytic setting. But the way I understand the couch as a tool is actually it's to prevent imaginary identification with the analyst, which would obviously work against the analysis itself. So in that sense, I get that part. But it is an important question to think about the relationship between the analyst and in terms of hierarchy, and if there's any kind of oppression being repeated from the social world within the clinic. I think it's an important question.
I would add, I think, there's more opportunity for reverie as well with a couch, which opens up a different access.
But opportunity also for abusing it, you see, because, and I think that's why the question is important. It's very seductive to feel one knows better. And you're always on the wrong territory when you're thinking that.
We have a question raised hand from Dharma. Dharma, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, please.
Hi, I'm finding the conversation very interesting, and I'm thanking all the speakers and the chat contributors. I was particularly interested by the idea of psychoanalysis as, and I'm paraphrasing this, as a white psychology or a white science. It should remind me of a question coming up in terms of responsibilities within supervision, within psychoanalytic supervision. At a conference, a class I was recently at BAPS, and the question of why the questions of intercultural responsibility and the responsibility to bring up race and difference so often redound to people of color, Black and minority ethnic clinicians and supervisors, and indeed clinicians. And I'm just thinking about that in terms of colleagues' thoughts about the possibility of white allyship, and interested in the engagement not only with non-Northern hemispherical thinkers and activists, but also those within the North. It's a very rich list of citations from Robert. But I'm also thinking about the impact and the problem of surviving and developing in terms of training and supervision, how critical a training and a supervision process has to become before it's not psychoanalytic in terms of the economic structurations of the organizations we come out of. And I think that's part of the unconscious, which is maybe not necessarily talked about by some of the wonderful minds alluded to today. I mean, if the self and other are actually a kind of useful binary, but also a fiction, the unconscious dynamic would include something about economics, basically, and the economics of exclusion. And another
Dharma, could I jump in there?
Yeah.
We've got quite a few people waiting to ask further questions. Yeah, so do you want to just finish with a question, or?
Yeah, I just also wondered whether the speakers had found useful either Lewis Gordon's idea of and Emmanuel Levinas's idea of the other, the ethical orientation beginning with the acknowledgement of the face of the other, non-analytical, philosophical response to Heideggerian thinking.
Okay. Wonderful question. Yeah, Lewis Gordon, I love his work, and he actually endorsed my translation that Anshu talked about. The concept of the other is probably one of the most confusing concepts in psychoanalysis and philosophy, because it's a very abstract one. It can be more concrete. Obviously, when you have the capital O other, then it becomes more abstract. And I believe Levinas actually, his notion is very complex. I think he has 4 different ways of understanding the other, 4 distinctions. So, but my understanding of it, when I speak about it, it's the capital O one. And for me, it has to do more with a system, discourse, which is ultimately tied to culture in the general sense. So when I talk about 2 others, and I talk about the modern unconscious and the colonial unconscious, I'm saying that we're mostly talking about the other still in a Eurocentric way, and we don't address this other as much. And so that's what I try to make explicit, is to talk about this other who is excluded. Obviously, in a more concrete sense, we're talking about non-European beings, subjects, etc. But we're also talking about systems of thinking, epistemologies, ontologies, ways of life. And so I think the concept of other is helpful in that way, to think more generally about a different way of being, a different existence that is not necessarily structured by the history of colonization and such.
I'm just going to read out some from the chat, because the chat is on fire at the moment. Danabas, is the system outside? Is psychoanalysis an institution embedded in a racist, misogynist culture in the air we breathe? So therefore the question is, where is it surfacing here and with us, between us? And how do we, both or within the group, think about it? Become curious, how does it manifest here?
Yeah, so that's something that Fakhry and I talked about yesterday, like the concept of internalization. All of us at the end of the day internalize this oppressive and violent system. And this is what we have to kind of reckon with, whether we're analysts or analyzans or otherwise. So that system lives within us all, but it's lived differently if you're European versus if you're non-European, but it's still internalized by all. And Fakhry's work is really wonderful in that direction.
Fakhry, do you want to say
I
something?
agree fully with what Diana is saying. That's where one has to begin. And I mean, I think it's what Robert's pointing us towards from the sort of looking at psychoanalysis from a broader point of view. What is the direction of travel? What is its discourse embedded with that prevents that kind of looking? So I completely agree with Diana. We have to begin with ourselves and look at it. But I think from work such as Robert's, our colleagues do us a great favor, it seems to me, when they emphasize the extent to which these things exist. They predate us. They exist out there, and we are called to take up a position inside of that kind of order. It's a very different model of development to the more conservative, traditional psychoanalytic way of looking at it. And I think if you take that into account, then Diana's absolutely on the money. It's not, there's no, I like the idea, there's no meta. You've got to start from where you are, and you are in relation to somebody else, and that's such an important kind of, realization.
Indeed. If we're breathing it in, it's no surprise that we're sometimes breathing it out as well.
More than that, it would be surprising if we were not. You see, that's what makes it more interesting psychoanalytically.
Laurie, hand up, Laurie, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, and really my question was prompted partly by Anshu talking about reverie on the couch, because really I want to refer specifically to the attitude of psychoanalysis or classical psychoanalysis to the dream, which I would suggest that in the kind of language that's being talked about today, that classical psychoanalysis treats the dream in a colonial way as a lively but rebellious kind of subject that is essentially deceitful because it talks in riddles and has to be deciphered, but has to be civilized basically through interpretation. And above all, this kind of focus on the dream as essentially the property of the dreamer, there to be mined by the dreamer with the help of the analyst as a kind of guide there. The contrast is with, I'm thinking of a paper I read by Robin Sherriff, who is an anthropologist who's written on critical race theory and done a lot of work in Brazil on dreams. And what she was saying was that contemporary Western ontologies are virtually alone in their historically recent assumption that dreaming is a purely intrapsychic phenomenon, and that historically and geographically elsewhere beyond the West or Westernized world, the sense that the dream is essentially a social experience with waking life effects. And I just wondered whether either of you would kind of comment at all on the relevance of the dream and this classical psychoanalytic attitude to the dream, and what the potentials are for change and a more radical opening of the possibilities of other dimensions in relation to dreaming.
I think that's a very good question. In Freud and Said, I talk a little bit about how Edward Said, he read the interpretation of dreams very closely and was quite influenced by that book, especially the method of dream interpretation. And in many ways, what I show in the book is how Said used that method and applied it to looking at Orientalism, or basically European fantasies about the Orient, as similar to dreams that could be analyzed in a similar fashion, and looking at, in some ways, the colonial unconscious, right? So that's one kind of fruitful way to think about it, to think of it. You bring out the kind of colonizing aspect of it, like maybe the archaeological dimension, right? but I think there's a way to use it. And this is why, again, I believe that we should not cancel psychoanalysis, because if we're interested in the unconscious, we have to continue referring to psychoanalysis. I think maybe a kind of provocative question is, and this is something I think a lot about, in a, if we're working towards a liberation, and not just liberation of the psyche, but social liberation in a political sense, in such a world, in such a utopian world, where will psychoanalysis be relevant?
Shall I say something about Laurie's thing?
please.
Robert, have you finished?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think your question is so insightful and so central, because I don't know, people will remember Lacan talked about the tyranny of the ego. And I think what he meant there is the sort of attitude that you're thinking about towards dreams. That is, that your unconscious, your dream world is there to be conquered, as it were. In Robert's very insightful passage in his paper, where he talks about the master attitude towards your unconscious. Now, that's not psychoanalysis. That is what Lacan rightly critiqued. It's what Bob Dylan refers to in one of his songs as us, as people who create roadmaps for the soul that we sell to the desperate and to the students. This is not psychoanalysis. One's attitude to somebody's unconscious ought to be the utmost respect. And what one's relief that the unconscious has produced the dream, and it needs to be treated in that way. And for us, the question is not what I have to say about it. The question is, can the patient tolerate that he or she is not master in their own house? And at this moment, whoever is out there, if you personalize it like that, has chosen to share something which could be valuable, even if painful and uncomfortable. Now, to my mind, that is an analyst's proper attitude to somebody's dream world. And you can see it's very different to a colonial master's attitude, and that's what Lacan criticized about institutional psychoanalysis. If we go that route, we finish up making roadmaps for the soul, and that is not analysis. Others can do that, but that's not what this discipline is about. So for me, what the attitude, you're so right to emphasize it as an attitude, and it's the wrong attitude. We are not there to conquer. It's the unconscious. We are there to try and speak to it and to see. And now I think it's so important because, for example, if you ever want to know about your own racism, you'll get volumes of answers from your ego that tell you all sorts of things, but you make no progress until you approach your unconscious with respect and say, look, I'm struggling with my racism. I want to understand this a bit better. Can you help me out? And unless you talk to your unconscious like that, it's never going to help you out. And you'll be stuck having, the conversations confined to consciousness, to things we know. So thank you for that, highlighting that. It's so, so important.
Another way of kind of, another way of kind of putting it is kind of like ethical listening, being open. And that free association as a concept for me is so central in that way, and especially the free in the association.
Yeah.
Indeed, I mean, the ethics of being a therapist are often get stuck on laws and regulations, and actually what you're both speaking about now is really what Laurie brings up is far more important part of the ethics of what we are engaged in. Your last point about speaking to one's unconscious, and Fakhry just makes me look at Salma Al-Attasi's question, where she's picking up Robert's point about double unconsciousness. And can this be also related to the idea of identification with the aggressor, Ferenzi's point? And I think that also links with something that comes up later as well, where Sheila Rashid says, I'm wondering whether our despair about change happening sooner is some form of internalized racism where we identify with the oppressor's wish to keep it going.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so.
Shall I
please
answer? Yeah, the identification with the aggressor, the identification with the oppressor is definitely a part of it. So my notion of double unconsciousness is based on Du Bois's conception of two-ness. He's talking about African Americans, how the African American is divided between African and American. And so the American aspect has to do with how the dominant subjects in that society view Africans. So that's the internalized racism there. And then there's the African conception of themselves, right? So the two are there. And so there's that identification with the oppressor, there's that internalization of oppression, but then there's a rebellious part of subjectivity that rejects that as well. And in a way, I think one thing that's powerful in Du Bois is that he talks about this two-ness, not just as a curse, because in a sense, it seems like a curse. I mean, this double division. But he talks also about it as a gift of second sight, in the sense that to be doubly divided, you're able to experience things from your perspective, but also experience how the other sees you. And that often distinguishes the experience of, let's say, white folks from racialized folks, as they don't have this other perspective. And so that's an important distinction to make, because, you know, there is a difference there.
I'm aware of the time. We could keep going. As often with these talks, there's never enough time. But I'm going to, and apologies to people I haven't been able to get to in terms of the questions and thoughts that are coming up in the chat. But I just wanted to end with Fembe Najirowe has asked a question. I wonder if Fembe would like to come online and ask the question directly.
Hi, thank you both for very rich discussions there. My question has to do really with the ability for psychoanalysis to be, I suppose, socially responsive practice in terms of containment, but also this idea of the transference being co-created. My specific question was to do with black-white clinical dyads and whether black rage.
Fembe, I'm afraid the signal's a little weak. You still with us?
Hi, did you pick up on that? Sorry.
No, we just
my
missed
internet's
the
not so good.
Just try once more.
How, working across this particular racialized clinical dyad, how can there be room for black rage to be held in the analytic encounter if psychoanalysis is to be psychologically healing, but also socially responsive as a practice?
Okay, thank you.
I'll let you answer that because it's a more clinical question.
It's linked to what somebody was asking earlier about, you know, it being, the reality is that our discipline as a whole does not take on board enough perspectives such as we've been discussing this afternoon. So it's not unusual for one to find that one's experience as a Black person is skirted around or somehow left out of the conversation. Clearly, I think that is wrong, because I'm always curious as to how people's blackness, if you think of it like that, how they experience it. What's it like to walk around on the streets over there? And I've found from my own experience and from what's emerged on the couch that it is absolute hell to live as a Black person in a white world, as I call it. Forgive the crude sort of generalization of that. So I'm not surprised that it's avoided, but I think one has to think that this analysis is my space, and that aspect of whom I am needs to be accommodated in there. So my view is, if your analyst isn't curious about it, you have to insist that this is part of your experience, and so on. It was my attitude in my analysis, but I was misguided. I just made an assumption. Everybody talked about what it's like to be them, and being, your racialized self is part of who you are. People look at you as though you're, to use Robert's thing, as though you're shit. How's that not going to feature in your session? I just took it for granted it has to. But I realize from speaking to people, it's very often translated into something else. And I wouldn't tolerate that in my analysis. I think people an analyst has to first hear what it is like to be you, to take it in, to bear it, before they have a right to analyze it, to say something about it. So that's what I say to all my Black colleagues who say my analyst is not interested. I say, insist, it belongs there.
I think that's a very good point on which to end. So please join me in thanking Fakhry and Robert for their wonderful contributions. If you'd like to unmute yourself and give a round of applause, that would be wonderful. It's been great to see some of you here today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Robert. That's a wonderful paper. And Fakhry.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank the Guild, my colleagues on the Race and Culture Committee, the chair of the committee, Fiona Yaron-Field, for their unstinting support. And, I'm sorry? Are we still live?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Sorry, I heard somebody say something. Thank you also to Stefan Mariansky for taking care of the technical aspects today, making sure everything went smoothly. I could sleep comfortably tonight, better than last night. A huge thanks to my co-organizer, Ivan Ward. Ivan has organized countless events during his time as head of learning at the Freud Museum. Sharing ideas and working together with Ivan has been a lot of fun. Thanks, Ivan. Finally, thank you all for coming, your excellent contributions in the Q&A. Please make a note of our next Decolonizing Psychoanalysis seminar on Saturday, 23rd of April. And we look forward to seeing you then. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you,
you,
Robert.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Salam.
Thank you, Anshu.
Thank you.
Bye.